You bought a movie theater. It is Friday night. The lobby is full. The concession line is moving. The parking lot looks healthy. People are walking into auditoriums carrying popcorn, drinks, and tickets they already bought on their phones. From the customer's side of the counter, this looks like the moment the business finally becomes easy. You have the crowd, you have the movie, you have the ticket revenue. But the first thing you discover as an owner is that a busy building and a profitable company are not the same thing. In the second quarter of 2026, AMC reported that its total attendance rose by more than 13% from the same quarter a year earlier. Food and beverage spending per patron also increased, and the company still reported a net loss for the quarter. That does not mean every packed screening loses money. It means attendance is only the beginning of the equation. The ticket has to be shared. The building has to be staffed. The lease still exists. Interest still exists. Equipment still ages. An auditorium that was almost empty 3 hours ago cannot sell those missing seats now. And the film creating all this traffic was made, scheduled, and distributed by companies you do not control. That is what makes a movie theater such a strange asset to own. The customer thinks you sell movies. The owner eventually realizes that the movie is only the traffic generator for a much larger economic machine. And to understand whether that machine can actually make money, we have to follow the first dollar that comes through the door. When somebody buys a ticket, the theater records box office revenue. But the theater does not simply keep the ticket price and treat the movie as inventory it already owns. The theater licenses the right to exhibit the film. AMC describes its film agreements as being negotiated on a film-by-film and theater-by-theater basis. Film exhibition costs are generally tied to admissions revenue and ultimately settled under the terms of those individual licenses. Some arrangements can work differently. The important point is that there is no honest universal rule that says every studio takes exactly the same percentage from every ticket in every week. That matters because one of the easiest ways to misunderstand this business is to begin with a viral number. Maybe you have heard that the studio always takes 60% or 70%, or that an opening weekend blockbuster can leave the theater with effectively nothing. Those claims are attractive because they make the business sound absurd, but they are too simple to build an ownership model around. A better way is to use a real company aggregate and label it correctly. In 2025, Cinemark reported that film rentals and advertising costs in its U.S. segment were 58% of admissions revenue. That does not mean your theater will lose 58 cents from every ticket. It means that across Cinemark's U.S. business for that year, those costs represented 58% of admissions revenue. As an owner, that distinction matters. Your headline product is not a normal retail item with a purchase price you control and a selling price you control. The economics are negotiated with a powerful supplier, title by title, and the content itself has enormous influence over demand. And those suppliers are concentrated. AMC said its 7 largest studio distributors accounted for roughly 83% of its U.S. admissions revenue in 2025. Marcus reported that 6 major distributors accounted for about 84% of U.S. box office revenue that year. So before you have sold a single bucket of popcorn, you already own a business with an unusual dependency. You control the building. You control the staff. You control the lobby experience. You control some pricing decisions. But you do not create the thing that gives millions of customers a reason to show up on a particular weekend. And even when that product works, part of its revenue belongs somewhere else. So the next question is obvious. If the ticket is economically shared, where do you have more control? This is where food and beverage enters the story. Not because popcorn is secretly the entire business, and not because a huge markup on corn kernels automatically becomes net profit. It matters because the theater retains much more of the economics of what happens at the concession counter than it does at the box office. Cinemark's 2025 U.S. numbers give us a useful way to see the difference. Its average ticket price was $10.52. Its concession revenue per patron was $8.30. Now take those company-wide numbers and build a deliberately simple model. Start with the ticket. At $10.52, applying that 58% aggregate film rental and advertising rate leaves about $4.42 before the rest of the theater's expenses. Then take the concession side. $8.30 of concession revenue after an 18.9% supply cost leaves roughly $6.73 before concession labor and the building's shared overhead. Put those two pieces together and our modeled customer contributes about $11.15 before the costs that keep the theater open. Notice what just happened. The concession purchase was smaller than the ticket price, but after the direct categories we modeled, it produced a larger contribution. That is the real reason concessions matter. But this is also where the most common theater business myth appears. If a popcorn item has inexpensive ingredients, it is tempting to describe everything above those ingredients as profit. It is not. The employee who made it costs money. The employee who cleans the auditorium costs money. The HVAC costs money. The credit card network costs money. The building costs money. The insurance costs money. The projector will eventually need work. Corporate overhead exists for a chain. Financing may exist for an independent owner. Taxes exist. Waste exists. Repairs exist. So the accurate statement is not that popcorn is pure profit. The accurate statement is that food and beverage can create much stronger gross contribution economics than the ticket, and that contribution is one of the things that has to carry the rest of the theater. That creates a coupled system. The film creates attendance. Attendance creates the opportunity to sell food and beverage. Food and beverage improves the economics of the visit. But none of it works if the customer never occupies the seat. And that brings us to the most unforgiving part of the business. You are selling inventory that disappears on a schedule. Imagine a retailer with 100 items on a shelf. If 20 sell today, the other 80 can still be sold tomorrow. A movie theater seat does not work that way. If the 7:30 showing starts with an empty seat, that seat is gone as a revenue opportunity the moment the movie begins. You cannot put Tuesday night's empty seat in the stockroom and sell it on Saturday. This makes every auditorium a small, perishable inventory business. The consequences show up in scheduling, staffing, screen allocation, and the value of a strong film slate. Consider one hypothetical auditorium with 150 seats and 4 showtimes in a day. That is 600 seat opportunities. Now hold the ticket and concession economics constant and change only occupancy. At 20% occupancy, that room serves 120 patrons during the day. The modeled ticket plus concession contribution before fixed overhead is about $1,338. At 70% occupancy, the exact same room serves 420 patrons. The modeled contribution rises to about $4,683. The screen did not become 3.5 times larger. The projector did not become 3.5 times more expensive to run for that day. The lease did not suddenly triple. You simply filled more of the inventory before it expired. That is operating leverage. And it explains why a great Saturday can feel extraordinary, while a quiet stretch can feel brutal. The film slate matters here because attendance is not evenly distributed. Exhibitors themselves warn investors that results depend on the quantity and quality of movies released. Successful titles have historically clustered around important periods like summer and the holidays, but an unexpected hit or miss can move the pattern. So you do not own a factory where demand can be smoothed simply by producing the same output every day. You own rooms that have clocks attached to them. A blockbuster weekend can fill those rooms repeatedly. A week period can leave the same expensive square footage underused, and the empty seats disappear forever. The uncomfortable part is that while the inventory expires, most of the building does not. A movie theater is a large physical operation built around short bursts of traffic. That means the owner is constantly trying to match variable demand with a cost base that is only partly variable. Cinemark's U.S. business gives us a sense of scale. In 2025, it reported $342.3 million in salaries and wages, $244.8 million in facility lease expense, and $377.5 million in utilities and other costs. Those are company-level figures. They are not numbers you can divide by the theater count and call a location budget, but they show you what kind of machine you are operating. Labor is real. Real estate is real. Utilities, repairs, maintenance, taxes, insurance, and transaction costs are real, and many of them do not fall in direct proportion to attendance. Cinemark's U.S. attendance declined in 2025, while its facility lease expense was relatively flat. That is the owner problem in one sentence. Traffic can move faster than the occupancy cost underneath it. You still need enough people in the building to sell tickets, run concessions, clean auditoriums, help guests, maintain the facility, and deal with the operational problems that appear when hundreds of people move through a property in waves. But staffing perfectly is difficult because the business is lumpy. A Friday evening might need a full team. A weekday matinee might not. If you overstaff the slow period, labor efficiency suffers. If you understaff the peak, concession lines grow, auditoriums turn over slowly, and the customer experience weakens exactly when the building finally has enough traffic to monetize. Real estate adds another layer. A suburban multiplex, a mall location, a downtown theater, and an independent venue in owned real estate can have very different economics, even if the auditoriums look similar to the audience. The lease structure matters, parking matters, nearby competition matters, the surrounding restaurant and entertainment mix matters. But there is no honest national lease number that tells you whether your deal works. The useful ownership question is more specific. How much fixed occupancy cost does this location carry, and how many customer visits does the theater need to support it through the entire year, not just on the best weekend? And even after you answer that question, the spending does not stop. Because a theater is not a building you finish buying once. It is an asset you keep upgrading. A new owner often wants one clean startup number. How much does a movie theater cost? The problem is that the question hides too many different businesses. An existing small theater with usable equipment is not the same project as a new multiplex. A conventional auditorium is not the same capital package as premium projection, upgraded sound, luxury seating, or a more complex food operation. Even public companies resist pretending those projects have one standard price. At the end of 2025, Cinemark disclosed $74.6 million of commitments across 7 continued development venue projects. The company explicitly noted that actual spending can vary with venue type, amenities, and construction timing. That is a better lesson than dividing the number by 7 and pretending you just discovered the average cost of a theater. You did not. The asset mix matters too much, and capital spending continues after the doors are open. Cinemark said it invested $219 million in capital expenditures during 2025 to preserve and enhance its global circuit. Again, that is not your budget. It is evidence that the ownership model includes a continuing capital cycle. Projection technology ages, seats wear, lobbies get dated. Premium experiences become less premium when competitors install something better. Food equipment, screens, sound systems, building systems, and digital infrastructure all require maintenance or replacement eventually. Then there is compliance. In the United States, theaters are public accommodations. One concrete federal example is the Americans with Disabilities Act requirement around closed movie captioning and audio description for covered digital presentations, including requirements to maintain the necessary devices when films are distributed with those features. That is not the only rule an operator deals with. The exact mix changes by location and by what the theater offers. The point is that ownership is not simply a license to put a projector in a room and start charging admission. You are operating a public-facing venue with equipment, employees, food, customers, and local physical infrastructure. Every extra revenue layer can also create another operational layer. And still, after you have spent money on the building, the technology, the staff, and the customer experience, the most important product inside the property is supplied by somebody else. A normal retailer can choose what inventory to buy, how much to stock, and often which suppliers to replace. A theater has less control over the product that creates its biggest bursts of demand. You cannot manufacture the next franchise hit in the back office. You cannot tell a studio to move a major release into your quiet month because your lease is due. You cannot guarantee that the film you expected to fill your largest room will actually connect with audiences. And the supplier base is concentrated. That 83 to 84% concentration around a small group of major distributors matters because the theater's traffic engine depends on relationships and releases from a limited set of companies. Public filings make another important point. Licenses are negotiated film by film and theater by theater, so there is no public master table that tells a small independent owner exactly what percentage a national chain gets, or exactly how much scale changes every deal. Scale obviously changes the context of a negotiation, but the contracts themselves are not a simple published price list. For an owner, the practical lesson is less dramatic and more useful. Some of your most important business variables sit outside your property line. A strong management team can improve staffing. It can improve cleanliness. It can improve pricing discipline. It can improve food and beverage execution. It can improve local marketing. It can choose which auditorium gets which title within the constraints of its bookings. But it cannot turn a weak national film slate into a great one. That is why the same theater can feel like a brilliant business during a run of popular releases and a very different business when the calendar softens. The owner response is not to pretend this risk can be removed. It is to ask what can be done with each customer who does arrive. Can you increase the value of the visit? Can you give the customer a reason to choose your theater instead of waiting at home? Can you create more reasons to use the screens? That is where premium formats, upgraded seating, memberships, and alternative programming enter the ownership model. But each of those ideas has to survive the same test. Does the extra revenue justify the extra capital and complexity? Luxury seating is one of the strangest decisions in theater economics because it can look wrong before you do any analysis. You take a room built to hold many people and install larger seats that reduce capacity. If all seats were equally valuable and demand were always sufficient to fill the room, that would be irrational. But theaters are not usually constrained by maximum capacity at every showtime. They are constrained by whether customers value the experience enough to come at all, and by how much they are willing to spend when they do. That is why premium formats matter. Cinemark reported that premium large-format auditoriums generated 14% of its global box office in 2025, while representing just 6% of its screens. IMAX separately reported a record $1.28 billion in global box office generated by IMAX films in 2025, 40% above the prior year. Those figures tell us that customers do pay for differentiated theatrical experiences at meaningful scale. They do not tell us that installing a premium screen automatically creates a good return for every owner. That is the mistake to avoid. A higher ticket price has to be compared with the capital cost of the upgrade, any additional maintenance, any licensing or revenue sharing arrangement, the useful life of the equipment, and the opportunity cost of changing the auditorium. A recliner has the same logic. The question is not whether customers like a better seat. The question is whether fewer, higher-value seats produce a better economic result after the investment required to create them. And public evidence does not support a universal promise that every recliner conversion increases attendance by some fixed percentage. So an owner should think of premium investment as a capital allocation problem. What is the incremental spend? What is the incremental revenue per visit? How much more often does the room get chosen? How durable is the advantage? What happens if the competitor across town makes the same upgrade? This is the broader theme of the theater business. The obvious lever is rarely free. More comfort costs capital. More food options create more operations. More technology creates more maintenance. More premium experiences can raise price, but they also raise the amount of money sitting inside the building. Which is why another important lever does not begin with the seat. It begins with frequency. A subscription or loyalty program changes the owner question from "How much did this person spend tonight?" to "How often can this relationship bring the person back?" Cinemark reported more than 1.45 million paid domestic movie club subscriptions in 2025. That was more than 5% higher than the year before and 50% above 2019. The existence of that scale does not tell us the profit of an individual member, but it does show why operators care about frequency. A repeat customer creates repeated opportunities for ticket revenue, concession spending, and engagement with the theater's own ecosystem. And there is another way to increase utilization: change what the screen is used for. Cinemark reported that alternative content accounted for 13% of its global box office in 2025. That matters because a theater's physical asset is not literally a movie. It is a room with a large screen, powerful sound, controlled lighting, seating, ticketing, food service, and the ability to gather an audience at a scheduled time. Hollywood films are the core use case, but not the only imaginable one. Alternative programming can give an operator another way to fill capacity that otherwise expires. The same logic applies to any secondary revenue stream in the building. The point is not to collect random side businesses. The point is to increase the economic value created by traffic and by underused capacity without adding so much complexity that the new revenue disappears into new costs. That distinction becomes even more important because the old assumption about movie exclusivity has changed. The theater no longer operates in a world where every major title follows one long, predictable path before home viewing. There is no single modern theatrical window that applies to every film. That sentence is less exciting than saying the window is exactly 32 days, or 45 days, or 90 days, but it is more accurate. AMC identifies shrinking theatrical exclusive windows as a business risk. Cinema United, in a 2026 policy statement, cited an average of 38 days for major wide releases in 2023 and 32 days in 2024, while pointing to much shorter releases from Netflix. Those are observed averages used in an industry advocacy document, not a rule written into every film contract. For an owner, the important change is behavioral. If customers believe they can wait a relatively short period and see a film at home, the theater has to give them a stronger reason to choose tonight. That does not mean streaming killed the theater. The 2025 premium format numbers point in the opposite direction of that simplistic story. Audiences still spend meaningful money on experiences they consider worth leaving home for. The competitive question is no longer only, can the customer see this movie somewhere else? It is, what does this visit offer that the home version does not? Scale, sound, a premium presentation, a social event, a particular kind of crowd, a night out. And for the owner, every one of those reasons has to be translated into economics. Can the theater charge more without destroying demand? Can it increase repeat visits? Can it increase food and beverage spending? Can it create another use for a room that would otherwise sit empty? The theaters that adapt are not escaping the structural constraints of the business. They are trying to earn more value from the customer before the seat, the showtime, and the moment all expire. But adaptation gets much harder when the operating business is carrying a capital structure that leaves no room for a bad year. That is what makes Cineworld and Regal such a useful case. Cineworld's Chapter 11 restructuring is often reduced to a headline about movie theaters being in trouble. That misses the more useful ownership lesson. When Cineworld emerged from Chapter 11 in July 2023, the company said the restructuring had reduced funded indebtedness by approximately $4.53 billion. It also raised roughly $800 million in new equity and secured about $1.71 billion in new debt financing. Those numbers tell you that the problem was not simply whether someone bought popcorn on a Friday night. There was an entire financial structure sitting above the operating business. The real estate side makes the point even clearer. EPR Properties, a major landlord to Regal, disclosed a post-bankruptcy master lease covering 41 of the 57 EPR properties that Regal had previously leased. The new arrangement began with $65 million of annual base rent, escalating 10% every 5 years, and it was a triple net lease. That means the base rent did not include taxes, insurance, utilities, common area maintenance, and ground lease rent that Regal was responsible for separately. This is what fixed cost exposure looks like at scale. The movie slate can be great or weak. Tuesday can be empty or busy. The lease still has a schedule. Debt still has a schedule. And once those obligations become too large relative to the cash the operating business can produce through the cycle, the company loses flexibility. AMC shows why this issue is not merely historical. At the end of 2025, AMC reported more than $4 billion in corporate borrowings and approximately $4 billion of discounted rental payments under operating leases. That does not mean AMC and Cineworld are the same case, and it does not mean AMC is destined for bankruptcy. It means the balance sheet is part of theater economics. An owner evaluating a location cannot stop at gross margin on snacks or average ticket price. You have to ask what obligations sit ahead of the owner: rent, interest, required capital spending, maintenance, and the timing mismatch between those obligations and a business whose traffic depends on a volatile calendar of films. The failure case is therefore not movies stopped working. The better question is, how much financial pressure can a variable operating business carry before a weak period becomes a restructuring problem? That is also why the adaptation case should not be a famous theater with nicer seats. It should be an operator working several economic levers at the same time. Cinemark's current disclosures are useful because they show an operator trying to improve the parts of the business that are actually within its control. In 2025, its U.S. attendance declined by 2.1%. But its average ticket price rose by 4.9% to $10.52. Its concession revenue per patron rose by 5.2% to $8.30. That is not proof that price increases can solve falling attendance forever. It is proof that attendance is not the only KPI an owner watches. Cinemark also reported that premium large-format screens produced a disproportionate share of box office relative to their screen count. Its paid movie club base exceeded 1.45 million subscribers. Alternative content represented 13% of global box office, and the company continued putting capital into the circuit. Notice the pattern. There is no single magic lever. One lever works on price. One works on concession spend. One works on frequency. One works on programming. One works on the perceived quality of the experience. The owner is trying to improve the value of every customer and the utilization of every room while living with a product supply chain that remains partly outside the owner's control. That is much closer to the real business than the phrase, "theaters make money on popcorn." Popcorn is one piece, premium presentation is one piece, membership is one piece, programming is one piece, cost discipline is one piece, real estate is one piece, capital structure is one piece. The interesting question is what happens when all those pieces are placed on the same asset? Because two owners can buy theaters that look almost identical to the customer and end up with completely different financial results. So let us build the same theater twice. Imagine an 8-screen U.S. multiplex. Each auditorium has 150 seats. Each runs 4 showtimes per day. The building is the same in both scenarios. The screens are the same. The seats are the same. The difference is what happens to the traffic and what obligations sit underneath it. First, define the physical capacity. 8 screens, 150 seats, 4 showtimes, 365 days. That produces 1,752,000 possible seat visits in a year. Of course, no normal theater expects to fill every seat at every showtime. The purpose of the model is to show sensitivity, not to define a national occupancy target. In Scenario A, the theater averages 18% occupancy across the entire year. That is not 18% on Friday night. It is 18% across every seat opportunity in every showtime in the model. 315,360 patrons multiplied by roughly $11.15 of modeled ticket and concession contribution produces about $3.52 million before fixed and shared costs. Add $350,000 of modeled contribution from other venue activity, and the property has roughly $3.87 million before the cost stack we have not yet paid. Now, subtract the modeled $2.65 million of labor, occupancy, utilities, insurance, maintenance, and local overhead. Reserve another $350,000 for recurring capital needs. Then subtract a $250,000 financing burden. The model leaves roughly $620,000. That is not a forecast. It is the demonstration of a workable structure. The theater does not need every show to be full. It needs enough annual traffic, enough contribution per customer, and a manageable enough fixed and financial burden that the entire calendar clears the cost stack. Now keep the exact same building and weaken the operating model. At 11% modeled occupancy, annual attendance falls to 192,720 patrons. With weaker monetization, assume $10 of ticket and concession contribution per patron. That produces about $1.93 million. Add $200,000 from other activity, and the theater has about $2.13 million before the fixed and financial burden. But the building is still the building. The modeled site-level cost stack is still $2.65 million. The capital reserve is slightly higher at $400,000. The financing burden is $450,000. Now, the same asset produces a modeled shortfall of roughly $1.37 million. What changed? Not the number of screens, not the building, not the smell of popcorn in the lobby. Traffic fell. Per-customer monetization weakened, and the financing burden became heavier. That is why the theater business can look so confusing from outside. A customer sees the same box office, the same concession stand, and the same auditoriums. An owner sees a system where small changes in attendance and spend per patron are multiplied across hundreds of thousands of annual visits, while the fixed cost structure underneath the property moves much less. The strongest operators, therefore, do not ask only, "What is our ticket price?" They ask, "How many people came? How much admissions revenue did we retain after film costs? How much did they spend on food and beverage? How efficiently did we staff the building? How productive is each auditorium? How much capital does this property need next year? What does the lease require? What does the debt require? How dependent are we on one strong season to make the whole year work?" That is the real ownership dashboard. And it finally lets us answer the question we began with. What business did you actually buy? You thought you bought a place that sells movie tickets. That is true, but incomplete. You bought a building full of inventory that expires every few hours. You bought a business whose most important traffic-generating product is supplied by a concentrated group of companies you do not control. You bought a ticket stream that is economically shared with those suppliers. You bought a food and beverage operation that can produce strong gross contribution, but still has to help pay for labor, rent, utilities, maintenance, insurance, depreciation, overhead, and capital. You bought a scheduling problem, a staffing problem, a real estate problem, a capital allocation problem, and, if you borrow too aggressively, a financing problem. The movie creates the traffic. The owner's job is to turn that temporary traffic into enough retained ticket contribution, concession contribution, premium revenue, repeat visits, and productive screen time to carry the physical asset underneath it. That is why a packed Friday night is valuable. It is also why a packed Friday night is not the answer. The owner has to survive the empty seats that came before it and the ones that will come after it. The screen attracts the customer. The rest of the business has to make that customer pay for the screen.